focus today is on that ever-present tension between artistic license and historical fidelity, and we're examining it through the lens of the 2006 film Apocalypto. I think this movie really is a perfect flashpoint for discussing how narrative filmmaking uses or maybe abuses historical context.
And it's a necessary discussion for sure. We have to start from a shared premise, which is that the director himself presented this as a work of historical fiction. He acknowledged it was crafted for, dramatic effect and wasn't intended to be a documentary, even though the material is so clearly drawing on the visual and linguistic elements of the classic Maya civilization.
Exactly. So the central question we're facing today is whether the film's undeniable success in articulating these broader, very serious themes, specifically this universal idea of a civilization's self-destruction through environmental issues and corruption, whether that justifies or is actually fundamentally compromised by its pretty significant historical and cultural inaccuracies.
And I'm going to maintain that the pervasive historical distortions, particularly that cultural mashup and the, frankly, unforgivable anachronisms, result in a depiction that is so problematic and misleading that it ultimately undermines any of the claimed thematic depth the film might possess.
And I'll be arguing the opposite, that the thematic utility and the narrative power the film achieves, well, they outweigh the demand for a strict historical adherence. The Mayan setting, while it is altered, functions very effectively as a necessary and powerful backdrop for these universal lessons about societal collapse. My core perspective is that we have to assess this film based on its stated intent, which was to create a powerful narrative of downfall and collapse designed for entertainment, not for documentation. The director's main goal was to show a civilization destroying itself. And to do this, he used elements of the Maya civilization that were genuinely resonant with their historical decline. The film uses specific, accurate elements for grounding. For instance, the commitment to having all the dialogue exclusively in Yucatec Maya adds an authenticity you rarely see in historical epics. And furthermore, the aesthetic elements, the costumes, the jewelry, the architecture, they clearly draw deep inspiration from real Mayan art, ceramics, and monuments, which lends the world a very specific and recognizable visual language. Crucially, the themes the narrative focuses on, like intense warfare, palpable environmental stress from the drought, and the internal corruption of the elite, all of those were genuine factors in the eventual decline of the classic Maya civilization in the 9th century. The narrative uses these authentic seeds to grow a powerful, albeit fictionalized tale.
I just come at it from a different way. We can't simply grade the film on intent alone when the results are so historically muddled. I mean, while using Yucatec Maya is commendable, absolutely, the resultant historical distortions are just too profound to be excused as mere dramatic license. It creates a sensationalized caricature of a very complex culture. The historical problems are sweeping, starting with the timeline. The most jarring issue is the anachronistic timeline, which takes the 9th century classic Maya collapse, an internal, slow event, and smashes it directly together with the 16th century arrival of the Spanish conquistadors. I mean, they're separated by hundreds of years. This temporal confusion alone creates a fundamental misunderstanding of history, and compounding this, the depiction of human sacrifice is dramatically exaggerated. It shows a massive scale and methods like heart removal that are far more characteristic of the Aztecs than the Maya, who practice sacrifice much less commonly and with different ritual intent. The film also commits a major reduction in its civilization depiction, creating this stark binary contrast between a brutal, corrupt city and a pristine jungle, which effectively overlooks the known and undeniable sophistication of Mayan science and culture. Let's really unpack the scale of this chronological distortion here. We are dealing with two entirely separate epochs of Mesoamerican history. When the great classic Maya cities, the ones known for the magnificent architecture the film draws its inspiration from, when they collapsed in the 9th century, it wasn't because of a foreign invasion, but a centuries-long process driven by internal pressures, endemic warfare between city-states, and, critically, environmental stress, like prolonged drought, which just decimated their agricultural base.
And that internal rot, that inability of the elite to solve the drought and maintain their legitimacy, That is precisely the engine of the film's plot. The desperate need for captives, the massive public rituals to appease angry gods.
Yes, but the film doesn't stop there. It collapses those 6 centuries of slow, agonizing post-classic transition and cultural shift, and it inserts the 16th century Spanish conquistadors right at the moment of the city's active, corrupt self-destruction. This means the audience walks away believing that the Maya civilization was literally defeated by the Spanish, or that the conquest was the coup de grace to a system operating at its peak dysfunction. That is a profound misrepresentation. When the Spanish actually arrived, the vast majority of the great classic cities shown in the film had already been abandoned ruins for generations.
I see why you emphasize that temporal gap. I really do. But I would frame it differently. The arrival of the Spanish isn't a statement of history. It is a profound artistic device. The film requires a final, external, crushing visual event to signify the absolute end, the closure of the narrative. The Spanish ships sailing through the mist, they represent a universal and historical symbol of external forces converging on a society that has already fully imploded from within.
But if that arrival is presented as simultaneous with the internal collapse, doesn't that fundamentally change the narrative context of the decline? By making the Spanish the inevitable inheritors of a fully rotten system, the film suggests that external forces were necessary to resolve the corruption. It lets the filmmakers avoid showing the more complex, gradual reality of how the Maya world transitioned after the great centers were abandoned, and instead they prefer a simplistic, spectacular end. Where does the line stop between symbolic amplification and just historical negligence?
The line stops where the thematic utility begins. The film's message is urgent. Societal failure is self-inflicted and leads inevitably to doom. By showing the Spanish, the director is not offering a history lesson on the timing of conquest. He is delivering a moral punchline about the fate of an internally corroded society. The focus is fixed firmly on the internal factors, the warfare and ecological failure, which are historically accurate reasons for the classic decline. That choice to blend 2 timelines is justified by the need for maximum narrative tension and thematic clarity for a modern audience who is probably unfamiliar with the nuances of Mesoamerican chronology. It's prioritizing the feeling of inevitable sudden ruin over a scholarly footnote on the calendar.
I remain unconvinced that intellectual rigor should be sacrificed for a mere feeling of ruin. The flattening of history inherently simplifies the complexity of the Maya experience, and that experience deserves more nuance than being reduced to a tragic tableau for dramatic effect.
We should also address the most visually streaking complaint, which is the exaggeration of violence and sacrifice. I acknowledge the scale of sacrifice shown is narrative hyperbole. However, I insist that the intense use of this brutality supports the film's central thesis of internal societal corruption and self-destruction. It's designed to shock the viewer into recognizing the system's moral failure.
I'm sorry, I disagree with the premise that intent excuses the outcome here. This isn't just hyperbole, it's cultural substitution, and it has real implications for how the audience perceives Mesoamerican culture generally. The choice to use the massive scale and methods, like heart removal, is intrinsically linked to the public memory of the Aztecs, not the Maya. Maya sacrifice, while it was absolutely present, was typically less massive. It often involved things like auto-sacrifice and ritual bloodletting, and it was performed with different ritual intent than the wholesale spectacle we see in the film.
But if the goal is to portray the idea of a civilization that has morally decayed to the point where its elite relies on spectacles of violence and oppression to maintain power, well, adopting the most visually dramatic elements serves that thematic purpose universally. They needed a powerful visual shorthand for corruption. The fact that the filmmakers went to great lengths to use the Yucatec language and authentic architectural inspiration demonstrates that they were not simply throwing darts at a map. They were attempting to ground a universal story within a specific cultural framework.
But why substitute? Why not use the forms of ritual violence that were authentic to the classic Maya? The things that would genuinely illustrate the elite's descent into brutality within their own cultural context. By borrowing the most sensationalized forms of violence associated with the Aztecs, they create a fictionalized pan-Mesoamerican brutalist society. This substitution fundamentally detracts from the film's authenticity, and it compounds the temporal issues we just discussed. It suggests a certain, laziness in the historical research, relying on established cinematic tropes of Mesoamerican bloodlust, rather than depicting the actual spiritual or political stakes of Maya ritual.
I'd argue that reliance on visual shorthand is an unfortunate necessity of the medium. The focus remains on the failure of the elite, the brutality of the system they maintain over their own people. The specific historical attribution of the method of brutality becomes secondary to its immediate narrative function in illustrating internal rot and ensuring the audience grasps the depth of the societal disease before the credits roll.
But the effect of that substitution is to reinforce a simplified and sensationalized view of pre-Columbian societies, reducing all complexity to a unified image of massive, theatrical human sacrifice. And this simplification actively works against the nuance required to understand the genuine causes of the Maya collapse, which were fundamentally structural, environmental, and political, not solely ritualistic. Let's shift focus now to the overall civilization depiction. My most profound concern is that the film's framing of the city as strictly brutal, corrupt, and the jungle community as pristine, it just oversimplifies the complexity of the Maya to the point of intellectual dishonesty. By focusing exclusively on the negatives, the warfare, the oppression, the environmental degradation, the film acts purely as a high-stakes adventure story. It completely overlooks the known sophistication of Mayan science and culture.
Consider that the thematic focus was never on celebrating cultural achievement, but on illustrating the failure of that achievement. The definition of tragedy is the undoing of something great. We know the classic Maya were masters of astronomy, architecture, and mathematics.
But the viewer's never shown that mastery. The narrative strips away the very greatness that makes the collapse tragic. The Maya developed the concept of zero independently, creating a highly sophisticated calendrical system that allowed them to track celestial movements with incredible precision. They had a complex written language. Yet the film shows us none of this. It only shows us a society that is superstitious, desperate, and driven by bloodlust. If the audience doesn't know what was lost, the fall doesn't register as a tragedy, but merely as a deserved end for a brutal, primitive regime.
I would say the film is not a portrait of a civilization at its height. It is an autopsy of a civilization in its final death throes. The historical themes it prioritizes, warfare and corruption driven by environmental stress, were indeed real factors in the decline. The filmmaker's choice to focus on the political and economic corruption that led to drought mismanagement and internal strife makes the civilization a tragic example of internal rot, rather than some simplistic villain. The film is trying to deliver a warning about our own modern civilization, a warning that applies when complexity fails to translate into good governance.
I accept that the tragedy lies in the failure of the complex system. But without showcasing the complexity of that system, the film defaults to presenting a civilization that always deserved to fall. Imagine if a film about the collapse of the Roman Empire focused only on the decadence of the last few emperors and ignored the aqueducts, the law, and the engineering achievements that define their earlier sophistication. The sense of loss is absent. The decision to strip away the sophistication, the science, the culture, is done purely for the sake of pacing and maximizing dramatic brutality. And that is a profound artistic concession that limits the depth of the thematic exploration.
I disagree. I believe the film succeeds in using the visible signs of decline, the drought-starved fields, the desperate human hunt, to imply the failure of the elite who must have once overseen great prosperity. The audience understands the system is failing because the foundations, the farms, the water are visibly ruined. That is the core theme of self-destruction communicated effectively. To conclude, I stand by my assertion that Apocalypto successfully uses specific, accurate elements, the language, the genuine architectural inspiration, to anchor a powerful fictional narrative. Its focus on the universal themes of self-destruction and corruption transcends the specific historical moment it depicts, and thereby prioritizes thematic depth and narrative impact over strict documentary precision. The film, I think, succeeds as a powerful warning.
And my position remains that the core historical inaccuracies, the severe timeline conflation, and the reliance on Aztec-like sacrifice methods for sensationalism are profound issues. These choices result in a fictionalized mashup of history. So while the thematic content on decline and corruption is certainly there, the framework is so fundamentally misleading about the Maya civilization that it ultimately impairs the very historical awareness it pretends to draw upon.
It is clear we still disagree on the cost of dramatic license and exactly where that line should be drawn between using history as inspiration and distorting history for convenience.
Indeed. But the material provides a valuable and, I think, necessary opportunity to discuss the inherent tension when historical sources are used as a backdrop for a fictional adventure.
Leaving the listener to decide if entertainment and themes of downfall can justify substantial historical and cultural distortion.